I'm delighted to say that to start our food conversation, we have His Excellency President Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda, to open us up with his overview on this topic. The title is Food, Glorious Food. I don't know, sir, if that will resonate with the discussion, but Your Excellency.
Thank you for your introduction. Let me, first of all, thank those who invited us to be here for this discussion. Today's topic is very timely, as it is clear that rising global demand and the competition for the key but finite resources of water, energy, and food cannot be ignored. It is estimated that by 2030, the world will need 40% more fresh water and 50% more food and energy. This increase is partly due to expanding population, increasing urbanization, and prosperity. In light of this, the world has to figure out how to optimize such vital resources, as we also search for new ones. More specifically, we need to address the issue of food security. The actions that we take now will determine our ability to feed the 9 billion people we are expecting by the year 2050. According to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the world's farmers actually produce enough food. In fact, they produce more than is required and twice the minimum nutritional needs. Yet, in spite of sufficient food production, there are still many food insecure areas. The World Food Programme identifies more than 1 billion people worldwide as undernourished, most of them in Africa, 34%, and Asia, 23%. This indicates that the question of food security is not about shortage per se, but rather other issues such as distribution, markets, management, and use of potential and available resources. In addition, developing countries face the challenges of smallholder farming, lack of technology and inputs, globalization, access to markets, and undeveloped infrastructure. Distinguished audience, to remedy this situation and put food where it is most needed, the right mechanisms and investments are required. As example of this, in an integrated approach to agriculture involving water and land management, use of fertilizers, crop development, planned rural settlements, and reform of land tenure. Facilitating elements of this approach include the development of financial services and technical training, as well as increased access to markets. As mentioned earlier, smallholder farming remains a challenge, and the key medium-term solution is to maximize use of available land through consolidation, crop intensification, and increased use of fertilizers and irrigation. Just as important is adaptation of green growth and climate resilience strategy, as we have done in Rwanda in key resource sectors of agriculture, energy, and mining. In the long term, however, the most viable option is to keep moving towards commercial agriculture by instituting land policies that enable consolidation, secure ownership, and transferability and access to credit. We can make more land available for agriculture and also raise citizens' incomes through skills development and creating off-farm employment. In Rwanda, what we have tried has been to introduce few years ago 9-year compulsory basic education, now extended to 12, and expansion of technical and vocational training, all this aimed at precisely achieving this. It is also important that we look at the expanding population as a potential resource in itself, and not always a liability. They can be part of the solution if we ensure correct policies and productivity that should increase as the population does increase. People should be empowered to find ways to increase resource efficiency, reduce waste, and manage demand effectively. Education, technology, and better management, as well as research, play a critical role in developing innovative ways to use our resources sustainably. Not every country can produce all the food it needs, and it may not even be the most effective, the most cost-effective way of meeting food needs. This calls for specialization in production and to create sustainable benefits and growth nationally and across the world. We must continue to make global market linkages and address other barriers like subsidies and stringent quality standards, whose main effect seems to be exclusion of products from certain places. Agriculture will only become more productive and profitable when investments are made in terms of technology, research and development, processing and marketing, and for this to happen, international cooperation is very vital. Equally crucial will be the increased involvement of the private sector in agricultural production at all stages of the food chain. a favorable business climate has made investment in Africa increasingly attractive. The World Bank reports, for instance, that 8 out of 20 of the most rapidly growing economies in the world in 2011 were in Africa, achieving between 8 to 12% growth per annum. In Rwanda, we have had sustained growth of between 7 to 8% per annum over the last 10 years. It makes sense for financial and business interests from across the world to invest in Africa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, given the 1 billion people who suffer from malnutrition and the 9 million people who die each year from hunger, we must place issues of agriculture and food security high on the international policy agenda, national development plans, and investment priorities. We need to take bold steps, mobilize resources and goodwill, and treat food insecurity as a threat to human existence in the same way we have tackled and reduced many other problems of our time. With this, I wish to thank you for your very kind attention.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. What an interesting introduction to the conversation. There we are, some of those growth rates others would be very keen to achieve in other parts of the world. We're open for business, private sector investment at every stage of the supply chain. Population is an asset. Perhaps to build on those, may I ask David Nabarro to take to the stage. David works very closely with the UN Secretary General on Food and Nutrition issues, and perhaps can take us from a context of Africa and national plans to a broader sense of the system, and perhaps picking up on this point of the role of the private sector in the debate. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dominic, Your Excellencies, particularly President Kagame. Thank you for the way in which you framed the issue, and I'm now going to pick up from how President Kagame left us with the challenges and talk about how the global community is addressing some of these issues, sometimes in quite surprising ways. I'm going to cover 6 areas, and it will be quite schematic given the time. The first is to go straight into this question of access and distribution. Enough food to feed everybody, how to make sure that the people who really need food, the billion who are hungry, the 2 billion who have micronutrient deficiencies, can actually access the food they need. Secondly, questions about sustainability, what have been referred to as the nexus of food, water, and energy, but also, as the President said, questions of access to land, ecosystem services, and how climate change is affecting this. Thirdly, what we've learnt, particularly in the preparation for and now follow-up to the Rio+20 Conference on Sustainable Development last month. Fourthly, the position of my boss, the UN Secretary General, on these issues. And fifth, some of the promise that lies ahead on which we can build and the challenges it will bring. But perhaps it's easiest if I don't go into too much detail into the issues and come straight to where I think we are after the Rio+20 experience. And let's keep in mind all the time what the President said to us about what is actually happening in many African nations. This very high growth rate, much of it based on agriculture and the use of natural resources, and lots of very exciting win-win opportunities that are being discovered and worked on. Well, first of all, in a way, Rio+20 was a kind of funeral procession. It was the last, I believe, of the great global United Nations conferences where there's an expectation that somehow 192 world leaders will be able to come together and establish a declaration and a plan which will somehow set an aspect of the world to rights. These kinds of conferences have been having a bad press for some years, but I think for many, Rio+20 really made the point that actually world leaders can't sort out problems of the future of global public goods in that kind of setting. And that's because most of them are on really rather short time horizons. They don't have electorates that are prepared to tolerate working on 10, 20, 30-year perspectives. They have to work in a very different and more constrained environment. And so what actually happened was that after a really difficult many months of negotiations, a fairly big bust-up about 2 months before Rio+20, and then some attempts to do rescue work almost the night before the conference actually started, a completely different kind of declaration emerged, which is much more a springboard for how different stakeholders will work together for the future of the world, building on the experiences of brilliant governments like Rwanda, like Brazil, and others who've shown that it can be done, but at the same time recognizing that governments alone can't do it. They need business people who've got 10 or 20-year time horizons to build their new markets and businesses, as Hans Rosling was suggesting. They mostly need civil society to help provide the compass and to ensure that there is accountability. And particularly, they need young people working with them who will say, look, it's our future that we're talking about, and therefore trying to find ways to encourage governments, perhaps in different ways, to look systematically at the future. A future based on rights, a future based on equity, and a future in which the kinds of maldistributions that we're seeing at the moment can end. What happens if that doesn't happen? Well, the answer is we know clearly that inequities around food, water, energy, wealth, access to land actually do create wars. They may not be always the direct trigger, but we're seeing so many examples at the moment of how these inequities are the source of conflict, that unless they can be dealt with through the combination of different stakeholders, the future for all of us is going to be extremely difficult. So that's why, both in the run-up to Rio+20 and subsequently when we were together last week and the week before in New York, our United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, now into his second term, which gives him certain advantages, said that he believes the role of the UN system is to help provide visioning and compass for the multiplicity of actors that are working on these issues in a context where global governance is itself probably not able to resolve them. And that means looking again at the institutions we have, looking again at the political processes within which we're working to try to address the kind of problems we have. Just if we look inside food, I'd like to enumerate those problems but not go into detail. There's been 25 years of really poor investment in Africa in too many countries. The current situation of supply and demand is very tight. A drought in one part of the world can trigger really serious volatility in prices. This volatility is usually exacerbated by those who want to speculate on food. There's a certain amount of money around at the moment, and we've already seen how much volatility can be enhanced in that way. Price volatility hits poor people very badly indeed. Unless there are strong social protection schemes and safety nets, a 20 or 30% rise in staple prices will lead to hundreds of millions of people getting poor and certainly increased death rates. And the social protection is inadequate in about 60% of the world's nations. That we are working still in countries that are facing really serious problems as a combination of climate change extreme poverty and population growth, such as in the Sahel, where investment in resilience is the key, and new ways of working are needed to do that, to support great people like the President of Niger and his 3 Ns program for the future. The economics of particularly natural resource use in agriculture are still undeveloped, and better ways are needed to do that. And nutrition has been totally neglected in international development action, but it's great that at least 40 countries are now prioritizing improvements in nutrition and scaling it up right now. So there's work to be done, and that agenda is clear, and certainly within the international system we're working on it. But to go back to what I'm referring to as the political context, I'd just like to highlight several areas of really promising action that I've seen over the last 3 years that I believe we can look at and learn from. The first is the coming together of business, civil society, national government, local government, financial institutions, cooperatives and organizations of farmers for completely new approaches to investment in agriculture, particularly in Africa, initially through the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, a terrible sounding thing, but it's really full of a lot of magic, and Rwanda was in that at the beginning, and more recently through an initiative called Grow Africa, which, based on work by the World Economic Forum's New Vision for Agriculture, has created new multi-stakeholder working for improved food and nutrition, has got, I believe, real potential for progress. That's one example, but we have perhaps 30 or 40 other examples of how multi-stakeholder partnerships are the way forward on food and nutrition. And this was particularly highlighted on May the 18th in Washington by the President of the United States and a number of other African leaders, together with international actors, really sketching out an agenda for a new way to go, which, as we heard from the President, is working. Second area to highlight that's promising is that we're beginning to see really major political organizations like the G8, G20, and other regional bodies, particularly APEC, ASEAN, African Union, Mercosur, putting equity of access to food, water, energy, and ecosystem services at the center of the political discourse, alongside terrorism, alongside the future of the world economy. That is important, and our major political leaders need to be continuously encouraged to go on doing that. It's great that David Cameron is going to have a hunger summit on April the 12th, towards the end of the Olympic Games for the same reason. Thirdly, we've got new styles of global governance emerging, not just member states, but the new Committee on World Food Security, bringing together civil society, business, private sector actors and others for multi-stakeholder working on these issues. Perhaps, you might say, perhaps, yeah, fine words, David, but is it enough? Well, no, it's not. But the future of the work on food and nutrition does require a combination of work to get market solutions, correct policies, most importantly, social contracts that ensure that people who are disadvantaged are in a position to participate more, and then the application of science to that agenda. And to that end, it will mean more partnerships, more movements, and a kind of governance and mix of institutions and codes of conduct that are suitable for that super-connected, multi-stakeholder way of working, rather than the old style where we thought somehow that if the United Nations could call a group of leaders into a room and say, sort it out, they would. Because, of course, they can't. Their electorates won't let them. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, David. So hopefully that's triggering some thought within you about the agenda and some questions. I'm going to call on look at this, how eager our panel are to get into the discussion. I'll call on them to come up to join us. This is Professor Charles Godfray, who's a director of the Oxford Martin Programme on the Future of Food, closely followed by Paul Conway, Vice Chairman of Cargill, and then Peter Howell, who's the UK Country Manager and General Manager of Europe for Rabobank. We will take some questions, as I said, on this, but I would like just to get a sweep from the panel first. What is interesting here? And we're perhaps getting into the heart of the discussion, which I suspect will flow through each of these food, energy, water discussions. And David, you introduced it on the back of His Excellency's presentation, is that rather than admiring the problem forever, there might be some movement in a more multi-dimensional way of addressing these things. You talked about multi-stakeholder collaboration and partnerships and interaction between the public and private. Your Excellency mentioned the role of the private sector in the value chain and how important this is becoming. And this is a different kind of language, perhaps, than if we'd have had this conference perhaps 5 years ago or maybe even more recently. Perhaps, Paul Conway, I can come to you as someone in this business, the Vice Chairman of Cargill. Do you sense movement in this space as His Excellency and David Nabarro have set out, or what's your feeling of where we are on this topic area?
Well, if His Excellency was standing for election in this country, I'd vote for him, because I jotted down some of the things that he said. The first one, land tenure, absolutely vital. Quality of inputs, quality of technology, access to markets, good infrastructure. These are the things that drive agricultural productivity. Now, unfortunately, we have the Doha round of the World Trade Organization is stuck. So if there were more leaders like His Excellency, I think we could make more progress than we've been able to. David and I were at a conference in January where Pascal Lamy spoke, and his phrase was that too many governments lack the air in their tires to finish off the Doha round. So very encouraging in individual countries, but in order to fulfill the target of not every country can make everything that it wants to eat, i.e. specialization, there will need to be more trade. The Swedish professor this morning showed a map which showed 4 billion people in Asia. So the people are in Asia. That's not where the land, the water, the sunshine to create the miracle of photosynthesis are. So there needs to be more specialization, more productivity, and the role of governments is principally to provide the correct environment for that to happen. Some do, some don't. Not enough do.
It's very interesting. I'll just sort of press you on that a little bit. This illustration of Doha and the challenges that the trade negotiations face. In a way, perhaps it's similar to the sketch that David gave us on Rio +20, that can we really expect government leaders to come to a table and address that, or are we opening up new possibilities, clubs of countries, partnerships, activities, innovations that can start to move things forward without the global top-down solution immediately being apparent?
Yeah, as David said, I mean, governments can't get 192 countries or presidents in a room and fix anything. They can provide the right environment where other actors, business, NGOs, civil society can come together, but providing the environment is very positive. In 2008, when we had a crisis of food prices, there were close to 30 governments around the world imposed some form of export ban, and that exacerbated the problem.
Very interesting. The context of the right kind of enabling environment for, if you like, kind of vehicles implementation to help and work with governments to get things done. If I can perhaps turn to you, Peter Howell, the UK country manager and general manager of Europe for Rabobank. Do you have any examples of the right kind of environment that you can see where you can put your money or talk to others from your industry about this? Is there movement from an investor point of view?
Yeah, I mean, we focus on food and agricultural, of course, globally, so we see it in all different forms. Echoing what Paul was saying, I think it's interesting when you talk about local enabling environments, which is very important, and when you talk about the multilateral enabling environments, clearly, it's not as that everybody produces everything. So we were talking about grains and oilseeds earlier, and I think there are, 7 countries that account for most of the production in the world of grains and oilseeds. So, and that only contains about 1 billion people. So you've got to have a multilateral solution. You can't just have one country solving the problem, and if it doesn't actually have what it needs. So we do see, I mean, obviously in some of the more advanced countries, you see very efficient production agriculturally, you see a lot of the enabling factors, you see the availability of the resource, whether it's capital or it's water, fertilizers. And then you see other countries like Rwanda that are in the development phase, which are worrying about things like land tenure, about payment systems, something that we've actually gotten involved with through a development bank we're participating in down there. So, you know, it's just different places have different, are in different stages.
A follow-up question for you before someone asks it from the audience. We've heard a lot about around the sort of price volatility issue to do with food, the speculation from the commodity markets and traders pushing prices up. What's your viewpoint on that?
Well, our own view as an institution is that we get involved with commodities as risk management for our clients, so we don't actually get into the proprietary side of it. We got asked this question a fair amount about volatility and the role of speculators, and there's quite a bit of research done on this. I think the UK Treasury's done work on this. We've done research on it. I know the UN's done work. Our view is that in the short run, the speculators do create quite a bit of volatility, and it's something that needs to be managed by our clients. In the longer run, I think we're seeing that price pressure is not actually being created by this. It's not as though big storehouses are sitting around somewhere with large amounts of food that could be released to the public. And I think that interestingly, in the last few years, we've seen production levels have been relatively high, but the buffer stocks have been decreasing. And I think what that's showing is exactly what this conference is about, is that the demand issue is starting. It's not tomorrow, it's not 50 years from now, it's happening right now. I mean, it's starting to happen. And we're seeing it in food prices, we're seeing it in the real price of food is increasing over inflation. And I think we're seeing it in the political and geopolitical context. We're seeing certain countries having to struggle with political stability because food has become an issue for them. So yes, speculators do create, I think, short-term, in our view, short-term volatility, which needs to be managed, but not really the long-term. We're not actually seeing it in the long-term increase in prices.
Thank you, Peter. Your Excellency, I don't know if there's any dimensions of the conversation so far that you'd like to remark upon or pick up on before we turn to the audience.
Well, I can just add to what I said and what others are saying, that we understand the problems. There is a whole host of definitions and identifications of what the problems are and what needs to be done about the problems. There are lots of resources out there that can be brought to bear on dealing with these challenges. It is great amount there is to really deal with issues as we know them. I think the main problem lies in people working together and going ahead and doing what needs to be done. This is where the problem lies. Even when people know what needs to be done, many times they don't do it. They prefer to do other things or not to do anything at all. But I think if we continue the kind of level of cooperation and collaboration that is required and focus on doing what needs to be done and do it the way it should be done and at the right time, I don't see why we don't continue to make good progress.
Very interesting. So perhaps you recognize some of the elements that David sketched out on the Rio +20 read of you use collaboration and partnership and focus on getting things done as opposed to presenting the argument in the text of a broad multilateral agreement that one needs to seek before anything can happen. Mm-hmm. Okay, questions from the audience. Now don't forget to say who you are and what you represent, and do keep the question brief rather than a statement or an advertorial. Questions to the panel to get the debate going. Here in the front.
Gunhild Stordalen, Stordalen Foundation. medical doctor. We cannot discuss this food issue without addressing the meat industry, which accounts for 1/5 of the greenhouse gas emissions, water, land use, deforestation, and so on, and also contribute significantly to chronic diseases, obesity, and so on. So how can we reduce demand and make a shift in the increasing meat consumption? According to the UN, the livestock number is expected to double by 2050.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question. We'll take a few and then perhaps we'll play them out on the panel. There was one over here.
David, very heartening what you said in terms of lessons from Rio. And I can tell you what you said, which I would summarize: the UN putting its weight behind coalitions of the willing, whether governments and smaller groups, provinces, cities, enterprises, public-private partnerships, is music to the ears of those of us who were in Rio, and I think had a much more productive agenda with results at the parallel summits of the civil society and business community. But my question to you is, how realistic is that? Because in a sense you're reaching a fork in the road, the UN, I would argue, exactly along your lines, where this really is a make or break for the future effectiveness of the UN international framework, because the world will move on. Is it really realistic? Let's link it to food and climate, which is so frustrating, because 40% of the climate problem is agriculture related. Do you think there could be in future, like it was tried in red, a real coalition building here with a limited number of countries, private sector? The Secretary General would put his weight behind to move forward. And how would that relate to the frustrating broad framework, Copenhagen to Cancun, to Durban, to Qatar? I had the honor to serve on the Secretary General's high-level advisory group on climate finance 2 years ago. And frankly, many of these ideas, 16 finance ministers from China, South Africa, US signed off on that report, were in that report, but frankly, the UN did not do much with it. How do you see the UN? It's very important what you said, but I doubt how feasible it is when you see the Global Green Fund, Global Climate Fund negotiations now, not even accepting many members, a private sector window, etc. You know what I mean.
Thank you very much. There's a question to follow up on the comments that you made, Dave. We'll take one more. I think there was over there.
Yes, good morning. My name's Camilla Toulmin. I'm the director of a think tank based in London called the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED. I was really very pleased to hear the emphasis on land tenure that was given both by His Excellency, the President of Rwanda, and more broadly by a number of the other speakers. We've worked a lot on this issue, particularly in West Africa, where currently more than 90% of land has no formal documentation. That's a level of insecurity and uncertainty around who's got rights over that land, which makes inward investment quite a tricky business, because you're not really quite sure what kind of benefits you might get from it were you to invest in it. I wanted to ask our speakers, not only His Excellency, but also others, given that scale of challenge, what do you think the next best steps would be to secure those rights, particularly for smallholder farmers, but also for investors who want and need to put big money into particularly irrigation and other forms of infrastructure? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's work on those three for now. It's quite a good palette. The meat industry, the land tenure question, and coalitions of the willing, realistic or not? Perhaps Paul, on the land tenure one, which was interesting. The question was sort of reflecting not just from a national perspective, but from those who invest. Maybe some thoughts from you on that issue.
Yeah, as we said, it is absolutely vital. The fact that some countries don't have formal land tenure, it can be changed. We used to own a business in Papua New Guinea where there was a well-established process, because there were no written documents at all, so it was verbal family histories were converted, and you were given 25 years plus another 25 years land use rights. So it is possible to do it if there are imaginative governments that realize just how important it is as their fundamental underlying basis of improved agricultural productivity.
Your Excellency, on this question of land tenure and the leadership that you and your country have shown in addressing these and other issues in the agricultural space, what reflections would you give to that question, or practical approaches that you've taken or you've seen others taken to address this?
I first agree with the one who asked the question, and that this is a very serious challenge, especially across Africa, and particularly in the part of Africa that she mentioned. And to deal with it, you got to start really with political will and policy decisions that have got to be made by different countries to address this matter as a serious challenge, but if addressed, and it is easy and possible to address, would open up for other opportunities in terms of dealing with other challenges the populations face in different parts of our continent. In fact, what we did in our country, just to use it as an example, we have had, in fact, partnership with the UK in the development partnership we have. This has been one of the areas they have brought in resources to help, but we had to make the decision, first of all, that this is something we need and need urgently because of several challenges that come together in this. For us in Rwanda, the land is very small. It's kind of fragmented. We wanted to have documentation of this so that then we can flexibly use the land in the hands of smallholder farmers, whether by consolidation or by other means, to make the land more productive as may be achieved in the process. In fact, we have already gone beyond now 90% in terms of documenting these pieces of land and ownership and so on, but we had to deal with issues of law that had to be put in place to facilitate that ownership. And in fact, it added to the value of this asset of land, because people could then pass them on or be able to access credit based on the value of this asset of land that they hold in their hands. In fact, we have gone beyond that and even digitized the documentation of this land registry. So and that has unleashed, very obvious, opportunities and potential to the owners, and we're already seeing activity and development and benefits to the farmers by doing this particular thing.
And in your experience, how replicable is that kind of model in other countries? Are you able to discuss that with your other peers and leadership groups, that this is a good way to go?
Very much so. In fact, let me put it this way. What is possible in Rwanda is possible elsewhere, anywhere else in the world. And people can even do and achieve more and better than we have. So that is the starting point. And we've done this, we've benefited, we are seeing benefits from it, and we are sharing what we are seeing and having in Rwanda with others. But again, it's up to the others to make the decision whether this is important for them and whether they think it's also urgent for them to do that.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you, David, and perhaps Paul again on the meat question. But to open up this thought, Professor Godfray, as the director of the Oxford Martin Programme on the Future of Food, this seems like a good question to throw to you. The meat industry, the role of meat in this challenge. Is this something that we need to look at structurally, or is it something that is just part and parcel of this demand shock that we're going to have to cope with?
It is pretty frightening, the statistics on the growth of meat consumption. And I think there are two possible responses to that. One is education and trying to let people know both the health and the environmental advantages of eating less. And that has been tried with some success, but my suspicion is that it will never be enough to reduce demand both for the health and environmental benefits that we require. And at the moment, there is virtually no possibility for government taking action in this because they could not bring their electorates with it. And I think there's a great need for a much more sophisticated discussion within civil society about some of these issues within meat. And it's wrong to say that all meat is uniformly bad. Some ways of producing meat is much worse than the others, both for health and the environment. And I think we need to have this sophisticated debate within civil society so that we can legitimize our governments to take actions for us.
Thank you. Peter, I'm going to come to you in a second on what would encourage you to invest in coalitions of the willing. Paul, you must have this question asked many times about ranching and meat and the role of meat in the food chain. What's your take on this?
Yeah, meat consumption in the Western world isn't really growing. So the issue is, do you say to those people in developing countries who are getting to the income level where they can afford meat as opposed to a grain-based diet, no, sorry, not allowed? We certainly don't think that's our role. In terms of the methane emissions, yeah, that's a problem. It's an inefficiency in the production of cattle, if you think of it from an engineering perspective. And we have a very large animal nutrition business and certainly are looking to formulate feeds that create a more efficient conversion and therefore, without getting too graphic, less methane emissions.
David.
Thanks very much indeed. There are a number of points that I think are close to what we're thinking about inside, certainly where I'm working. When we think about the United Nations, it's worthwhile distinguishing between perhaps three different parts. One is the collection of member states that are actually the United Nations, around 192. It's slightly different depending on which part of the system you're looking at. The second is the network of about 60 institutions, some of which set norms and standards, some of which promote particular activities, some of which will try to repair things that go wrong, like the World Food Programme. And thirdly, the United Nations more as the expression of the total interests of humanity and the various coalitions and partnerships and movements within that broad framework, which is reflected in the UN Charter, so it's, I think, reasonable to consider it. Now, the Secretary-General, any Secretary-General, has to operate within the space that is permitted by the member states, within the collective of the institutions and their own governance, and within the broader sense of what the different coalitions and partnerships are doing. I'd say that Ban Ki-moon, together with his new deputy, Jan Eliasson, a very seasoned diplomat from Scandinavia, together with many of the leaders of the system, I won't name them because I think that would just waste time, but they're very powerful and strong people in their own right. They are saying, we've got challenges in getting member states to come in behind a lot of things that really matter these days. We've got institutions that to some extent have had their own compass for many years, and we need to harness that energy and get it to be more coherent. But most importantly, we've got so many partnerships and coalitions emerging that involve government leaders, business leaders, civil society leaders, social movements, that it is a very rich environment within which to work. But there's often one key element that is missing, which is the compass, the direction finder. Because when you have this complexity, there may well be situations where people get lost. Now, one person's compass may be another person's direction to a bad place, but we found in Rio+20 that particularly on the area of agriculture, food and nutrition, there are a number of areas that seem to matter just about equally to everybody. The main thing is that people would like to see an end to hunger. And within that, they'd like to see food systems actually deliver nutritious foods to everybody everywhere. They'd like to see agriculture that is sustainable and that is not destructive to the environment. They'd like to see smallholder farming systems actually work better, delivering more productivity and livelihoods. They'd like to see big reductions in waste, particularly between the point of production and the point of consumption, and also a reduction in wasteful consumption patterns by people who really shouldn't be doing it. And perhaps really significantly, they'd also like to see improvements in nutrition. And these 5 elements of taking it from the top: access to food, sustainable agriculture, smallholder productivity increases, zeroing on waste and loss, and trying to really reduce chronic malnutrition also towards zero, are the 5 elements that Ban Ki-moon announced in what he calls his Zero Hunger Challenge, which is based on what President Lula did in Brazil, based on what many forward-thinking governments are doing all over the world. That's the compass that we're now using for the whole system. It's the post-Rio compass on all our work on agriculture, food and nutrition. And I believe that there is a reasonable chance that if enough stakeholders in civil society, business and others can align behind that compass, that we will be able to help the different coalitions and partnerships move in the same direction.
Thank you, David. We'll just...
I want to talk about meat, if you'll allow me 10 seconds.
I think we'll probably have to do that on the side, perhaps with the person who asked the question.
Just remember, many smallholder farmers depend on livestock for their incomes, particularly pastoralists. There are 2 issues there on meat.
So just to take us into the break, I want to come back to you, Paul. We've had a very sort of good menu that's been set out of where the UN or others might see movement in the space, and we've heard from the floor that these coalitions of the willing might be able to come together. I mean, could these provide the sorts of bankable projects involving governments and aid agencies and the private sector, which I guess is the sort of thing that you're perennially searching for? And what would be your suggestion to those who think that this is a way forward? What would you absolutely need to see in those kinds of propositions?
As a cooperative bank, we've taken a fairly long-term view of things, and actually give a concrete example. We have, I mentioned the development banks a bit ago, and we have 6 banks around the world where we're a minority investor. We have no exit strategy. We don't really expect to make a lot of money. In fact, we're really just trying to cover costs. We've contributed staff to try and help these banks, and it's focused on rural, it's focused on agriculture, and actually, interestingly, these have turned into reasonable propositions for us. Yeah, it's very interesting. We didn't go into it with the idea of, you know, a profit motive per se. It was just something we were trying to do, as again, following on cooperative principles. And it's worked out quite well. So I think that really taking a longer term view, being a little less focused on the next 3 months returns, and realizing that there actually are efforts going on to try and improve the enabling environment, that things will change and they will get better.
That's interesting. That will tee us up nicely, I think, for our energy conversation next. The slightly longer term view that things are being done to try and improve the enabling environment, which might not be kind of a one shot to change everything, but trying to find movement in the space. Professor Godfray, your thoughts from what you've heard, sum us up and take our guests to the break.
So I think the final message I'd like to leave you with is that there's a real danger of fighting the last war. And I don't think that collectively we really realize quite how much the food system is changing. We've heard from Hans Rosling right at the beginning some of the good news about population growth declining, but still we're going to see a massive amount of demand at a time when production shocks are going to go up, and at a time when the structure of the food system is changing completely. Many more people are connected to global markets, they're living in big urban areas, and the corporate structure of the food chain, of the food system has changed. Much more corporate consolidation and vertical integration. And I think the challenge to the many private sector people here is to work with civil society, is to work with governments to forge a global food system that actually works in favor of food security, that provides the food security, that unleashes the innovation of the private sector, that makes use of the comparative advantage of different parts of the earth to produce food, but yet simultaneously, as Professor Sen said, simultaneously protects the poorest people, the billion people that David talked so eloquently about. And we need to do that because A, it's the right thing to do, and because if we do it wrongly, we're going to see political and economic dislocation of a type that we haven't seen for very many decades.
I'd just like you to join me in thanking so much our esteemed panel for a very interesting conversation.